right, welcome back. We are going to look at slide 25, pick it up where we left off. So in 1921, the Nazis organized a paramilitary organization or storm detachment called the SA, or the Sturmabteilung in German. The SA, not to be confused with the SS, the Schutzstaffel, totally different thing. This group of thugs, bullies, and disgruntled Great War veterans wore brown shirts that were actually patterned after Benito Mussolini's black shirts. They were led by a man named Ernst Röhm, and their primary function was to protect speakers at Nazi party rallies, but they also were very active in vandalizing businesses, breaking the glass out of establishments, terrorizing citizens, cajoling voters to vote the way they wanted them to. And in fact, ironically, their behavior is very similar to today's modern-day Antifa organization, which is ironic because Antifa stands for anti-fascist, the very thing that they are. And so the brown shirts were certainly the forerunner of today's Antifa. Now, young people, I'll say this, our nation is sliding down a slippery slope, and you would do well to learn history. In fact, it was Hitler himself who said, quote, "When a constitution proves itself to be useless for its life, the nation does not die. The constitution is altered," end quote. And that's really where we are today. Those on the far left consider our U.S. Constitution useless and antiquated, and they want to see it altered, just like Hitler stated so long ago. Slide 26, next slide there. On November the 9th, 1923, Hitler and the Sturmabteilung, the SA, the brown shirts, attempted to seize power in Berlin after meeting at a place called the Burger Bräukeller. It was a very popular Munich beer hall. And this attempt failed and was known as the Beer Hall Putsch, and it landed Hitler and some of his co-conspirators in prison. Next slide. Hitler served only 264 days of a 5-year sentence. The Beer Hall Putsch also dealt a serious setback to the Nazi Party. But Hitler spent the 9 months in Landsberg writing Mein Kampf. Hitler recruited Erich Ludendorff, and the two took part in a government coup called the Beer Hall Putsch in 1923 that I mentioned a moment ago, and both men were arrested. Hitler spent 9 months in Landsberg jail. While he was there, he dictated My Struggle, or Mein Kampf, to Rudolf Hess. Slide 28. Interestingly, in most video footage that you watch of Hitler, and you can go on YouTube and actually, or you might be able to, I don't know if they may have taken that off, but if you can see some of Hitler's speeches, and you'll see him how melodramatic he is and how he uses these over-the-top hand gestures. And he was actually coached by a man by the name of Heinrich Hoffmann. And Hoffmann would take pictures of photographs of Hitler, and then the two of them would kind of study the photographs and discuss which poses would be most effective in speeches. Next slide. Hitler was elected chancellor in 1933 in January, and began spreading his ungodly ideology throughout Germany. Germany also withdrew from the League of Nations at that same year. Hitler rejected the optimistic values of the 19th century and was in favor of a worldview in which race and race alone was paramount. In Hitler's view, Marxism, capitalism, socialism were all diseased ideologies which flowed from the Jews that were meant to destroy civilization from within. Now, only fascism was an ideology that he could get behind. Next slide. Now, there has arisen a considerable amount of confusion over the word socialist or socialism as it applies to the Nazi Party. And this question is very logical. I mean, if Hitler despised socialism, Marxism, communism, and he did, why would he change the name of Anton Drexler's German Workers' Party to the National Socialist German Workers' Party? I mean, Why tack on the words National Socialist? Well, originally the DAP, the German Workers' Party, had a left and a right faction. And like pretty much all political parties, they had policies that came from both sides. Early on, they put out a 25-point plan that contained socialist policies about the redistribution of wealth to create an equal society, minus the Jews, of course. Of course, this smacks of pure Marxism, which is what Hitler supposedly despised. However, as time went on, the right-wing faction took over the party, and Hitler himself was against many socialist policies, and it's believed that he only accepted them for a time to win votes, which is why the party was called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. However, most of the Nazi or NSDAP's support came from the political right. Hitler himself spent a lot of the 1920s living off of donations from and even living with rich industrialists who were supporting the NSDAP. Their plan and their name may have suggested socialism, but their actions and their words didn't. One of their policies had been the banning of war profits, but how many German companies made money from the war? Well, lots did. So to gain power, the NSDAP, the Nazis, formed its political alliances on the right in opposition to the socialist and communist parties on the left. After gaining power, there was a split within the NSDAP. There were those on the right, including Hitler, who were ignoring the original 25-point plan. There were those on the left who wanted the revolution to continue and wanted the 25-point plan to be put into place. Next slide. On June the 30th, 1934, Hitler carried out what is known as the Great Blood Purge, or the Night of the Long Knives. And this purge was carried out against the Sturmabteilung, the brown shirts led by Ernst Röhm, the SA. Because their radical activities were upsetting political groups Hitler was trying to woo into his corner. Many were rounded up that night and murdered. Next slide. The man placed in charge of the Night of the Long Knives was Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler. Take a look at that face. The title Reichsfuhrer was both a title and a rank that existed between the years 1925 and 1945. It was the highest rank in the Schutzstaffel, the protection squad, or the SS, that there was. Himmler murdered around 1,000 people during this purge, the Night of the Long Knives, and following the Great Blood Purge, Hitler knew he could count on Himmler to essentially do any dirty work that Hitler didn't want to do. This shortly led to Himmler commanding all of the Schutzstaffel, or the SS. Now, next slide. The SS, the Schutzstaffel, was essentially a paramilitary group of soldiers designed primarily to be Hitler's private army or bodyguard detachment. Interestingly, ancient Roman emperors also had a similar group of men that were called the Praetorian Guard, who, instead of dressing in the traditional Roman armor, wore black helmets and black armor. And like the Praetorian Guard, the SS didn't wear the typical field gray uniform of the regular army, but wore black uniforms and black helmets, unless they were in combat. And as early as the Polish campaign, the armed section of the SS, or the Waffen-SS, started to use camouflage. And in fact, they were the first group of soldiers really to use a standardized camouflage garment. I'm going to show you a picture of one of these garments from World War II, if I can get it unfolded here. And if you were in class with me, I would let you come up and take a look at this. But this is known as a smock, a Schutzstaffel SS smock, and so pretty cool. It was designed in the 30s, and it was reversible. So you had the sort of the maybe the summer look, and then on the inside you could turn it inside out, and you can see the colors there, but it was kind of for fall. And so SS soldiers would wear this smock over their wool tunics, their wool uniforms. Another item of SS equipment was this source, primary source. This is the, of course, that's the swastika for the German army. But on the other side, this lets everybody know that this is the Schutzstaffel, the SS. You can see the SS runes there that were the significant calling card of the SS. And when people would see that symbol, it would strike terror into their hearts, because the SS was particularly brutal. They were really the ones that carried out the Holocaust. Next slide. Once the Reichstag, the German headquarters building, burned down on 27 February 1933, Hitler gained absolute power in Germany, and that's when he formed the armed version of the SS, or the Waffen-SS. Next slide. Another new ideology called, really not new, but it was now new to Germany, was called fascism, but that began in Italy right after the Great War ended. Next slide. Fascism is a form of radical authoritarian nationalism, and it consistently evokes the primacy of the state. It views political violence, war, and imperialism as a means to achieve national rejuvenation, and it asserts that stronger nations have the right to expand their territory by destroying weaker nations. Now, Hitler took this view a step further and began proclaiming what's known as Lebensraum. Lebensraum, it's a German word, Lebensraum, Lebensraum, and it means living space. And so Hitler took this view of fascism a step further and began to eye the Soviet Union to the east as fertile land for farming that one day the Germans could occupy. Both Hitler and Benito Mussolini embraced fascism. Another origin for World War II was the rapid militarization of Germany. Next slide, slide 37. As Hitler furthered his military interests in Germany, the Spanish Civil War broke out in July of 1936. And this Spanish Civil War, it served to distract much of Europe from what Hitler was secretly planning to do. It really played right into his hands. And both Germany and Italy sent troops to Spain to fight with Francisco Franco's nationalist troops against Republicans. In many ways, the Spanish Civil War served sort of like a dress rehearsal for World War II for Germany and Italy. And the Soviet Union as well sent supplies and troops to the other side. Next slide, slide 38. In 1938, Hitler assumed control of the War Ministry of Germany, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, or the OKW, and he appointed General Wilhelm Keitel as the chief of the OKW. Now Hitler controlled both the German military and the diplomatic bureaucracies. Next slide. That same year, 1938, Hitler threatened neighboring Austria, and they allowed themselves to be annexed into Germany. And this event happened in March of 1938, is known as the Anschluss, A-N-S-C-H-L-U-S-S, the Anschluss. So with Austria's money now, Hitler had an underwriter for the costs of his rearmament program. And so, not to mention that by annexing Austria, he gained Austrian soldiers that he amalgamated into his army to the tune of about 85,000 soldiers. In the spring of 1938, gorged on Austria's loot and the bullying of defenseless Jews in Vienna, Hitler then turned his attention on the nation of Czechoslovakia. Amazingly, while this was going on, most of Europe just sat by and watched, did nothing about it. Now, why do you think that happened? Think about that for a minute. If we were in class, I would be picking hands that were raised. But if you think about it, these nations, I'm talking France, England, they didn't want another World War I. And so they were more apt to sort of turn a blind eye to what Hitler was doing. Next slide, slide 40. Speaking of turning a blind eye, British Prime Minister at that time, Neville Chamberlain, a weakling if there ever was one, in an effort to appease Germany and hopefully prevent another world war, convinced France and the Czechs that it would be the only hope for peace if they were to agree to give Hitler what he wanted. And so, as a result of that, Neville Chamberlain signed the Munich Agreement, or the Munich Pact, on September the 30th, 1938, which essentially gave Germany the German-populated area of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland. Next slide. Now, although Chamberlain returned to England as a hero, Sir Winston Churchill, who had fought the Germans in the Great War, savagely summed up Chamberlain's appeasement with a quote from the book of Daniel, chapter 5, verse 27, where he said, "Thou art weighed in the balances and found a wanting." He was, of course, speaking of Chamberlain. Next slide. So with the West floundering, Hitler then moved to secure his gains in Eastern Europe, taking Bohemia, Moravia, and Slovakia. And within 3 weeks of signing the Munich Agreement, he ordered the military to get ready to occupy by force the rest of Czechoslovakia. See, the Sudetenland wasn't enough for him. He wanted the whole thing. And he began to terrorize Jews and other non-Aryans. Finally, Britain took notice, and Chamberlain began offering Hitler money, industrial loans, other concessions, if only he would behave himself. On March the 15th, 1939, Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, and it remained occupied until Germany surrendered after the war, May of 1945. Next slide. Outraged at Chamberlain's weakness and audacity to think he could push the Führer around, Hitler decided then next to invade Poland. Next slide. Since Britain and France had promised to come to Poland's aid if they were invaded, they were then forced to declare war on Germany. But their inaction during Germany's annihilation of Poland and the days preceding the invasion of France in the summer of 1940 resulted in this weird period known as the Phony War, or the Sitzkrieg. The Phony War was an 8-month period at the start of World War II, during which there were no major military land operations on the Western Front. It began with the declaration of war by Britain and France, the Western allies at the time. America wasn't in the war yet, against Nazi Germany, and they both, France and Britain, declared war on Germany on September the 3rd, 1939. Next slide. Right before Hitler invaded Poland, though, he sent his foreign minister, a man by the name of Joachim von Ribbentrop, to Russia to sign a Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, also known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, because the Soviet Union's foreign minister was Vyacheslav Molotov, and so Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In August of 1939, that was signed. And that pact, that agreement, promised Joseph Stalin part of Poland if he would invade from the east. So while the Germans came from the west, the Russians would come from the east and sandwich Poland in between. And so about 3 weeks into the invasion of Poland, the German invasion of Poland, the Soviet Union, on September the 17th, they joined in the fight as well. And those two, the Soviet Union and Germany, were allies, if you can believe it, until June of 1941. Next slide. On September the 1st, 1939, German tanks, troops, and planes crossed into Poland in a lightning attack that historians call Blitzkrieg. And this was known as Case White. The Germans would color code their operations, their invasions. For example, Case White is the invasion of Poland. Case Green is the invasion of Czechoslovakia. So September the 1st, 1939, World War II has officially begun. France and Britain declared war on the 3rd. The United States preferred to sit this one out and become the arsenal of democracy by providing supplies to the Allies. Next slide. The inspiration for maneuver warfare, which is what the Germans were famous for and which they excelled at, and which evolved into the term we know as Blitzkrieg. I would like you to read the 2 articles on that I have included in Canvas. But the inspiration for all that maneuver warfare, or what's known as Bewegungskrieg, was not a modern contemporary of Hitler, but rather an 18th century Prussian king and general named Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia, and who reigned during the late 1700s. And when Hitler, it's interesting, when Hitler retreated to his underground bunker at the end of World War II, or the end of the war in Europe, only one portrait painting was found hanging on his wall, and it's the one that you see on the slide there, and it was Frederick the Great. So let's talk for the remainder of this lesson. Let's discuss how prepared the Allies were, the various nations were for World War II. And so one of the great truisms of military history is that nations prepare for the next war by observing lessons from the previous war or wars. And regarding World War I, the Great War, only in Germany and Russia was this found to be the case. Because of Germany's geographic position in Europe, German military planners generally believed that they had to be ready at a moment's notice to fight a two-front war. I mean, if you think about it, they're bordered on one side, the West, by France, who is the age-old enemy of Germany, and they're bordered to the east by the massive Soviet Union. And so, in order to accomplish this, being able to be ready to fight a two-front war, they would have to be able to fight and defeat their enemies, one after another in rapid succession, rather than at the same time. And so this is where they become experts at Bewegungskrieg, or maneuver warfare. And this thought process drove their planning and resulted in the creation of one of the most important expressions of military doctrine in military history. And it's this book right here, Truppenführung, or on the German art of war. And the impact of this manual cannot be overstated. For years after World War II, historians and analysts assumed Germany's early success was attributable to the fact that they had better planes, more tanks, better tanks. But that wasn't the case at all. That's not true. The French and British had about the same number of troops as did the Germans in 1939 and in 1940. And when it came to tanks, the French actually had better tanks than the Germans did in 1939, 1940. So, but what the French didn't have, and what the British didn't have, was this. The Germans took Truppenführung to heart and employed a realistic doctrine of combined arms and Bewegungskrieg, or maneuver warfare, which gave them an advantage over their foes who had been living and studying an operational doctrine that was more suitable to the conditions of 1918 versus 1940. So Truppenführung is an effective presentation of the concepts of Bewegungskrieg, or maneuver warfare. It was tried and tested by the German army in the years after the Great War. And by the start of the Second World War, German officers understood, it had been ingrained into them by this book, the principles of mobile, armored war long before they ever rolled the first tanks into Poland. Next slide. Had they studied the ancients, they may have figured things out even earlier. Alexander the Great, who lived from 356 to 323 BC, arguably was the greatest military genius in world history. And it was Alexander who actually pioneered the concept of combined arms warfare for Western civilization. And he did that when he invaded and conquered the Persian Empire. Now, regarding the readiness of other nations, let's talk about Britain first. Britain chose to reject the notion of preparing for another war. In fact, they failed to develop a combined arms doctrine. They were just content to carry out the status quo. They did rely heavily on their Air Force, the Royal Air Force, and they built planes. France also veered away from the combined arms concept, and they defaulted to their method of maximized firepower and tight control of troop movements. Also, they mistakenly believed that their vaunted Maginot Line would protect them. Now, the Maginot Line was named after the French Minister of War, André Maginot, and was this line of concrete fortifications, obstacles, weapon installations built by France in the 1930s to deter invasion by Germany and force them to have to move around their fortifications. And the incredible irony in all this was that France and Britain could have stopped Hitler from invading Poland if they wanted to. For one, Hitler was fully committed in Poland. Had the Allies attacked in strength, they could have broken through the thin screen of Germans across the Rhine River while Hitler's army was tied up in the east. So it becomes a classic sin of omission on their part. So Britain, France, let's talk about Russia. Russia embarked on a massive program of industrialization. And for those of you that have taken recent European history, you'll recall that in the interwar years between the Great War and World War II, Russia had experienced a civil war. And as a result of that, communism ruled and reigned. And Vladimir Lenin, who created Bolshevism, if you will, died of a stroke, and his underman, his second guy in charge, Joseph Stalin, stepped up to the plate and took control. And Stalin implemented what was known as the 5-year plan, and there were a few of these. And the first 5-year plan laid the foundation for a fully mechanized Soviet army, or the Red Army. In fact, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union on June the 22nd, 1941, the Russians already had 17,000 armored fighting vehicles. Unfortunately, in 1939, Joseph Stalin purged most of his top Russian army officers, had most of his armored units disbanded, because he didn't believe that armored formations would play any kind of a significant role in future warfare. Italy displayed both military and political incompetence in the years leading up to World War II. Sloppy training and inefficient defense spending did little to get Italy ready for war. Japan prepared to gain control of China and Manchuria in the 20s, and they did so in the 30s. And military training was really something that was woven into the fabric of their entire society. Every citizen in Japan was a potential warrior, and this had to do with their code of Bushido, their Oriental code that stemmed from the samurai. The United States had shifted back into isolationism following World War I, following the Great War, but the experience in World War I paved the way for this extensive analysis of the Allied Expeditionary Force's performance during that war, or the American Expeditionary Force. And so as a result of that, their entire doctrinal warfare had to undergo renovation. And it did, but it was a little late in coming. But after Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, the United States was faced with a dilemma on how to balance the logistical needs of supplying Britain with arms and materiel. They also looked to the east to see what Japan was going to do. Next slide. Last slide. Notice this propaganda poster of Hitler here. Notice how youthful and energetic he appears. He's holding the Nazi flag in his right hand and has his left fist clenched in a sign of stalwart determination. An eagle flies directly overhead with the sun's rays gleaming out from behind it. And what this tells us is that propaganda is going to play a huge role in World War II. And we'll learn a little bit about that more later. And so, if you have any questions on this lesson, I would like you to go ahead and you can submit an email to me and ask me, and I will try to answer those. But right now, what we are going to do, if I can bring it up here on my computer, is we're going to go ahead and go over the first note sheet. And let's see here. I'm trying to figure out how I can do this. And I don't think I can while I'm recording. So what I'll do is I will include the keyed version. I'll have to add that to Canvas, and so look for that. It'll be in the lecture note sheets, but it will say something like lesson number 1 keyed, and that way you guys can download that and fill it in and get the right answer. So I look forward to seeing you next Monday night, and I hope you enjoyed this.